On proposition Mexico. And on opposition the USA. I, Tracy Lee, am your chair, and I'm joined by my colleagues Michael and Jushma. And I invite the first speaker from side proposition to open the debate. And can I just have a wave of who's going to be timing? Official timing? Thank you. Official timing. Good. So first proposition speaker, when you're ready.
The system of ordering rights is entrenched into the belief that women are nothing more than the property of men. They are objects used for their pleasure, their satisfaction, their fun. They are toys, and we are very proud to stand against the disgusting industry of the importation of rights. Three things in this speech. I will present the definitions, characterizations of this speech. I will present my team's stance, and further my team's arguments. So, what does this debate look like? Right importing is when a man agrees to pay and sponsor immigration of a woman into his country in exchange for her agreeing to marry. We think this happens in two core ways. The first is the publishing of women on mail order websites. Right? This can be done by the individual, by a pimping, or by an escort agency. Otherwise, it can happen through an individual transaction between a man and a woman through something like an instant messaging service. This can happen throughout a variety of regions, right? From Thailand to Mexico, from Russia to the USA, from Nigeria to South Africa. No, thank you. But we think it's generally understood as moving to a more developed country. What is this not, however? We don't think this is the individual sponsoring of a migrant for any reason that is not contingent on marriage. That is a requisite for these existence. We do support things like the reform of immigration to make migrant processes easier, simply because they eliminate the need that this industry is founded on. So, what's our stance? We believe that the government must ban this because it fundamentally goes against the principles of autonomy of the self. It objectifies women. Secondly, it leads to extremely abusive practices, both in the relationships and in the industry as a whole. No, thank you. And it is a business solely based on restrictive immigration laws. So, our arguments. The first, a principle of why it is fundamentally wrong for the government to accept these practices. Fundamental rights of individuals aren't being protected. Let's look at the best case scenario, in which there is consent between a bride and a buyer, where the bride sells herself in exchange for easier access and immigration. We think this is not okay. In principle, selling your liberty means selling every single second of your life. You belong to someone else. The bride herself is the product that is being sold. No, thank you. The point is, your entire future is contingent on the satisfaction of another individual. You no longer live your life for yourself. You exist as a tool of somebody else. We think this is equivalent to slavery, where you have no agency over your future path. Notice how this is independent of whether or not love exists in this relationship. Why don't we think that a person can just give up their right to liberty if they consent to it? We think autonomy of an individual is the only difference between a human and an object. We think that their ability to exert this freedom is what allows them to make every single choice in the future that they ever will. Yes?
If marriage is such a ripping away of autonomy, can you, and literally slavery as you say, would you then ban poor people from trying to marry rich people?
Marriage is absolutely not taking away the autonomy of an individual because it's a consensual agreement between two consenting persons. We think that's completely different, and the fact is the power dynamics in a relationship such as this one, where your existence, your very purpose, and every second of your waking life is dependent on the satisfaction of another, is categorically different from a consenting relationship in marriage. And notice how these situations of importation of rights aren't about being punched and kicked and physically abused, but it's still abuse. Why? Because you constrain the individual to a one-dimensional object. The moment that the government allows these kinds of practices, it is explicitly condoning the violation of people's most fundamental rights. We think that individuals simply can't consent in this situation, not because it's just ugly, but because it means that they give up their entire humanity. their entire existence and their ability to ever exert consent again is sacrificed in the interest of migration. In principle, the government can't allow this independent of its practical impacts. On to our second argument. We talked to you about power dynamics, and we say about how, in practice, these marriages will never be just. Secondly, the people that come into these countries are legally disadvantaged in the cases where they wish to escape from their toxic, abusive situations. We think that there's fundamentally unequal power dynamics in contrast to a regular marriage. Because there's two situations that we outline in this debate. When a man orders a maid or a bride, she is 100% submissive to her, right? They have to put on a pretty face and work for her. Think of the emotional toll that this has on the individual. They often sink into massively crippling oppression, having no one to talk to with genuinity. We think that this is especially clear in the example of the Russo-Mexican community, because we see that these are people who exist and who bond together because of the very fact that they have no other alternative. They exist as a service of the Mexicans who have imported and sacrificed their humanity for their physical pleasure. The fact that this is nothing but a transaction means that it is extremely likely to become abusive. It means that these people are far more likely to fall into cycles of defensive and offensive relationships between these two individuals. What happens when there is love? And when a man asks a woman that he previously met and buys her love? We think that firstly, these power dynamics are still extremely evident. And notice how we're not against migration. But we do think there exist legal and legitimate means to achieve this love. Simply going to migration offices, supporting your bride and getting her visa is not only more romantic, but we think that it takes away the fundamental transactive part of this relationship. This is mutual support. This is a situation in which both individuals agree to take care of the other and agree to support them in pursuit of their individual happiness. In most cases, we say that these will result in profoundly inhuman marriages, and they are extremely likely to turn abusive. Second, why are the solutions simply ineffective? Solutions like divorce, like running away from your abusive husband, are ways to move up the social ladder, sure. But notice how the only human outcome of these relationships is ending it. We think that's firstly not okay. We think their status as immigrants makes it extremely difficult to carry out self-sustaining legal processes. What do we mean? Things like the fact that they often have difficulty speaking English, that they are ethnically discriminated against on their appearance. The fact that they have no access to local family and other support networks means that they are deeply alone. Systematic issues against these people, in particular against women in a patriarchal society, have to be taken into account. What do we mean by this? We think that the single women that are left behind by these relationships suffer profoundly in their status in society. Two reasons why this happens. First, and most importantly, we think that these women have no access to recover their traditional resources and their traditional ways to move up the social ladder. We are talking about things like work. We're talking about things like joining the workforce. The fact is, oftentimes these people have spent their entire lives waiting in search for someone to pick them up as a bride. We don't think that this is necessarily capacitating them to join the workforce, and that's why it's harmful. These people aren't going to have the skills required to be able to sustain themselves in society because of the way that the industry is structured. Second, these women will not have access to traditional resources like child support. We think that an outcome in which a woman bears a child is extremely harmful because of the fact that firstly, this woman isn't going to be emotionally and physically capable of sustaining such a feat. But secondly, we think it's extremely harmful in as much as the child isn't able to have access to traditional resources. We think the moment in which the only solution for these women to not feel so profoundly, deeply afflicted is to bear another being that will have to suffer through their life is extremely harmful. We are very proud to propose for the side that stands for the rights of women, that sides against slavery, and that sides in favor of open, free migration, and a system that doesn't abuse the individual.
I thank the speaker for his remarks, and I invite the first speaker from South Opposition to the panel this evening.
being a woman is hard, but being an immigrant woman is even harder. The last thing that an immigrant woman needs when making a choice regarding their own sustainability and well-being in society is having someone tell them that their choice is illegitimate and not rational. Because we reject facilitating this response and this narrative, we are so proud to oppose this motion. In this speech, a couple of things. First, a few notes on opposition's stance in this debate before refutation of proposition material, and then 2 substantive arguments. But first, let's address a couple of notes on framing. On side opposition, we will allow for the importing of brides, but only with significant government oversight. We support any regulation that maximizes the ability for these women to have autonomy. What does this look like? First, it looks like ensuring informed consent. So spousal visas all the time take a lot of things, like a lot of paperwork. We would support things like background checks to make sure that the men who are in these relationships have not been in the past extremely abusive. Second, we will offer a pathway to citizenship that is reduced after she receives the spousal visa, so it's easier to become a citizen and have the full rights of someone living in that country. Third, in the event, which we would think is an extreme minority of cases, but in the event that a relationship becomes abusive, we will offer protections to the women who are victims of this abuse so that A, they may not necessarily have to leave the country in cases like seeking asylum, or B, so that she just feels isolated to that she has no resources. We will provide resources for her. The last thing we would just like to clarify is that we don't have to defend things that are obviously illegal, like child marriages, human trafficking. We would support increasing regulation on that. The second thing I'd just like to note for our framing is that the trend of immigration right now looks like a crackdown. Countries all the time want to restrict the amount of immigration that they're allowing in these countries. So the ability of these individuals to move freely, whether it be for upward economic mobility or the potential for love, is greatly restricted. We support this avenue. But quick, a note on proposition's framing. They tell us that they support reforming immigration completely so it's easier to migrate. Great, we do too. The problem with this is that you cannot simply fiat that reformation is going to exist for an immigration system that is so complicated. Take the United States, for example. You can't just simply fiat that you're going to reform the immigration system. Even if you could, we think that we can also claim that, so that way, if they prove it so pernicious, that those women wouldn't have to enter into these relationships, but we think it should still be an option. Let's respond to case material. The first thing that they tell you is about the idea that women are incapable of consent. This argument is super problematic. They tell you that every time you enter into a marriage, you are someone else's property. Note, this narrative is simply untrue. If I want to marry a rich guy just because I want to marry someone wealthy, that doesn't mean I'm his property, right? That makes absolutely no sense. To be clear, their argument is about protecting autonomy. Then why do they literally take away the autonomy of women to decide whether or not they want to enter into these relationships? In response to a POI that Ishan asked them, they say, oh no, autonomy is promoted whenever you have consent. Note that their PM literally told you that this argument was in the instances that consent occurs. At that level, they've conceded the principle of this debate, meaning that we should allow these women to make these things. The second thing they tell you is that there are unequal power dynamics in this relationship, so that's super harmful. They tell you that women in these relationships are inherently submissive. We have we have a lot of problems with this. First of all, we do not think that these structures are inherently unequal. The same justification exists in other relationships too. So sometimes there is an unequal balance of power. If I come from a poor background and I marry someone that's wealthier, they have more power relative to me in society. That doesn't mean that the relationship can't be consensual or is automatically abusive. Second, we told you in the extreme minority cases in which abuse occurs, we would support women seeking help for that abuse. But note, that we would not ban it entirely. The next thing that they tell you is that women can't move up the social ladder because they don't have the skills or ability to do things like work because they just wait around and wait to be married in their home countries. We think that this is absolutely ridiculous, right? Women have lives before they get married. And in this instance, we think that they have the skills in order to promote themselves in these communities, but also the benefit is that you are able to move to a country where you have financial stability. In that case, we think that there are those harms that they talk to you about in their substantive argument. With that being said, let's examine our first substantive argument on the women's right to choose before I go on. Go ahead.
Would you allow for people to sell their organs?
If you can prove to us why this is principally consistent with our case, note that we do not believe it is, then we will engage with it. Until then, we do not have to defend that. Our first substantive argument is on the women's right to choose. First, let's characterize what these relationships look like. We refuse the premise that they are inherently coercive. It can never result in love. Note that even relationships that don't begin in love can transform into loving relationships sometimes. We see this with arranged marriages in places like East Asia and India all the time. But second, even if we assume that these will never be loving and are not romantic, why is this still okay? Because people make decisions for marriages all the time based off who they want their life partner to be or what they want their life to look like. It's not a bad thing for me to sacrifice wanting love if I want to marry someone in an economic position. We think that this is the woman's choice. This is why some people get married for tax breaks or purely socioeconomic mobility. Even if this is unsavory, people make these trade-offs all the time, and choosing to marry someone for money is not completely illegitimate. But first, we should analyze the question of when it is justified for a government to ban a practice of individuals. Only whenever there is an active, significant harm that is intrinsic to that action and infringes on an individual's ability to interact with others, or second, they cannot legitimately consent or make rational choices in that case. Note that A, our regulations address significant amount of the harms that they bring you about, and they implicitly concede that consent is possible through their first substantive argument. But what is the intrinsic action of being an imported bride? No, it's not that I'm a submissive woman who's just waiting to be married off. Rather, it's I, as a woman, am choosing to move to another country because I want that life for myself, meaning because this is a choice that as rational women should be allowed to make it. Also, we would just reject this characterization that women are incapable of making decisions when calculating their future, right? Give people more credit. Women, especially in cases of economic desperation, do not have the most rosy view of the world where they see their white knight riding off into the sunset, ready to save them. We think that these women have realistic conceptions of what these relationships would look like and why they would not intrinsically be coercive. Women have the right to choose. Our second substantive argument is on how marriage brings materially better conditions for these individuals. This happens in a couple of ways. First, we bring you the idea of guaranteeing stability, because there are immediate needs that individuals require access to that cannot access in the country that these women may be originally from. Whenever they move to the generally wealthier country of their new husband, we think they get access to immediate needs, like, for example, just moving to a more secure environment, being less exposed to things like unemployment with no jobs or crimes and things of that nature. Second, oftentimes it looks like a thing of a guarantee to shelter. So now you know that you have a house to live in because that was probably required whenever you were discussing whether or not you wanted to move in with this man, especially if it's not out of love, as proposition characterizes it to you. Third, you may have things like an access to health care where you didn't before that is covered probably under your spouse's plan. The second benefit that we get from this is that women can access their wants. They can live more economically comfortable lives. If proposition's characterization is true, that these men have the money to be able to provide for these women and bring them over, we think they also probably have the money to be able to support both of them, because those men wouldn't want to live lives of economic desperation just so that way they can have a wife. We think that they're very capable of providing for both of them. Note that this also engages with their material about children, because we think these children's lives will also be materially better. The third benefit is the idea of exterior benefits. You're able to send things like remittances back to your home country. We think this necessarily benefits the lives of people who were not there in the first place. At the end of the day, this debate is extremely clear. Do not let proposition fool you. Women are not toys. They can make their own choices. Opposed.
Thank Cindi for her remarks, and I invite the second speaker from side proposition to continue policy this week.
When you look at this debate, you'll recognize that for the last 7 minutes, the last speaker only talked about the fact that women can make certain choices, and they give you like 30 seconds on why the only substantive benefit that they have is that they can have stability. On cycles of abuse, on cycles of disengagement with these individuals, we think that the fact that they can only tell you that people can make choice when literally the alternative is non-existent in many scenarios, we incentivize for the government to take better action, to have better policies we are proud to propose. 3 things in my speech. First of all, engagement to their 30-second argument on stability. Second of all, on the restrengthened offer case. Third of all, I'll actually tell you why you actually result on having worse things. Why the incentives of these people have money, therefore they'll care is not true, right? Because when you go through these processes, you're likely really know to give the best quality of life to these women in the first place. They don't engage with the majority of our principle, because they do say these individuals have consent in many cases, but they don't really engage with the point of autonomy. It is not the same thing, right? On one side of the house, we tell you that in the majority of cases, the fact that to a certain extent you will no longer have control of your body and your life, meaning that the reason for why you did it is because you were contingent on something, was a principle that still stands. But what they answered was that these individuals might have consent of doing it, right? Meaning that you do legally say that you want to do this. But let's go into their mechanism before, right? Because they say, we will first of all check that these individuals were not criminals and check that you're ensuring that this is informed consent. If this was the case, we would not have abusive relationships in the first place, right? This is ridiculous. If you could just ensure that people have not been abusive in the past, then individuals will not just in developing countries continue to have marriages after marriages, even when women have run from them, right? In the majority of cases, we don't think they even tell you how they are going to do this. But specifically when they talk about things such as, we're going to ensure informed consent, the next speaker has a very big duty of taking a second of telling us what does that look like, right? Because when you have no choice, you signing a document in which you say that you do consent to this is not really consent to the extent that you have to do this in many scenarios. On our side of the house, we have things and we incentivize for things such as the government and individuals subsidizing people to go to the country, not contingent on the fact that they're going to get married. And the government is more likely to support things like that. Just to clarify, we don't have a mechanism or we don't have open borders or something like that. The only thing we're saying is, as a stance, we do support border control. We do things like lessening certain processes. They can have it on their side too. We just think this is something on the ideology of our team. Before I go into your point on stability, yes.
Oh, so you talked to us about a banned industry typically goes underground. Insofar as you say that the marriage industry is so bad, how is it whenever it now exclusively has to operate on the black
I
market?
think that in your side of the house is more likely for things such as human trafficking to occur in the moment in which you don't have checks and balances of understanding what things are happening or not. Because as long as we can prove to you that through this ban, it is less likely for these things to happen, we think that people that are clearly doing things such as human trafficking cannot do it through the traditional methods of just doing it through methods, not traditional, but common methods such as just taking them through the border. But why is it that their stability doesn't occur on their side? They talk about the fact that you will have shelter and a better life because these people will have the incentive of just paying for you. Recognize that the motion in the first place only tells us that what they will subsidize is the traveling of this individual. But as long as we say, even if you have shelter, to the extent that you will abuse in those cases, there is a trade-off to be made and that is not worth it. And even in the cases where this abuse doesn't happen, which is taking their best, we do think that still, right, they cannot ensure this, and saying that they can just because is not enough, right? In the majority of cases, these people can, because they have the possibility of exploiting these businesses and situations, just not provide for this shelter, not provide for this food, or just not allow for these women to go work and do these types of things, right? So to that extent, we don't think you can ensure these types of things. On our side of the house, we think the fact that there's little to no regulation, it is more likely for these abuses to happen, right? Because they talk about things such as they might have money to maintain them, but the fact is these individuals might just have the incentive of not spending as much on that person. And to that extent, we do think that you're not meeting that thing, you cannot ensure that this happens. But the most of what we hear on the last speech comes to the refutation of our case, where they face to say that women can make these choices. I think this is extremely easy to answer into saying, if you want to give the characterization that these women do not have any choice, you cannot simultaneously say that they made it under give the assumption that they made it entirely conscious of what they're doing, right? If you have no choice, we think it is better to incentivize the government to take other policies, right? Because when they talk about the idea of a poor person marrying a rich one, we would say that is probably terrible too, right? The abuses are probably just the same. The difference is it's very difficult to find it on our side. The fact that you can say other things are bad too doesn't legitimize for that to happen, yes.
So you are conceding that your side of the house rejects poor people trying to marry rich people for economic mobility.
Look, first of all, we would say in the majority of cases, the line isn't as clear, right? You cannot just say poor and rich people. In the majority of cases, if it's as extreme as in these cases, where it is a very vulnerable person with a very rich person, we think these abuses can still happen, right? We don't think that that is good, right? But the reason why in many cases we only ban these types of things is because it is contingent on the traveling of these individuals and getting into a place where you travel alone and will have no possibilities of reinserting into society, right? The response that we hear from women have lives before neglects the premise of the majority of of migrants that in the status quo are not having the possibilities of reinserting in the first place into the systems, right? To the response in which they say women aren't submissive, and they give this example, we would say yes to the extent that this person was the one who took you to this country, to the extent that these are the people that took you through these processes. We don't think that consent really exists in those scenarios. But let's really engage with that with a third argument, in which we tell you that this harms women that are already in vulnerable positions because of their context. First of all, this is prone to abuse because of the sacrificing of women and families because of certain cultures. That is to say that in countries like Lebanon, where women are convinced by families to go to other countries through these processes so that they can send money back, even in the best cases where like the man does care about them, you are legitimizing certain cultures in the first place in which these women are sacrificed. But recognize that in the majority of cases, these women will not even use this money to sustain themselves, as they have a duty to, in many cases, their families. In Lebanon, the majority of people that go through these processes send the money back home, and to the extent that they live in marginal conditions in these countries is extremely bad. This allows for exploitative systems where they don't have the benefits that they claim. But second of all, where you are burdening these individuals into existing in positions in which they cannot enjoy the best cases of the opposition. But by this not being banned, the system takes advantages of legal structures of other countries. We think the moment that, like for example, developed countries show these types of things, it is less likely for things such as the blurry lines on human trafficking to occur. It is more likely for things like human trafficking to occur because they don't have clear lines onto what's happening. As long as we can reduce these types of situations on our side of the house, you cannot just take someone to the border through extreme coercion on your side of the house and saying that it was consensual, because we still don't hear how is that this happens. But furthermore, people start becoming dependent on other methods that are offered, meaning that in many cases, people might not just go through the legal systems, and they can also go under their side of the house, because this is a stable and a band-aid solution. Autonomy relies on the idea that in the majority of cases, the fact that in the long term, you do not have the possibility of protecting yourself, that is bad. They have to engage with the bad case scenarios, which, by the way, is the most likely ones, in which these people can just exploit these types of things. As long as we can prove to you that in the majority of cases where this happens is developing countries from Lebanon to Iran, or in cases from South Africa from Nigeria to South Africa, we think that the exploitation and the characteristics that these people have will continue to occur. We are proud to propose.
As any speaker for his remarks, and I invite the second speaker from the opposition side to continue off, please.
Opposition 2 had a massive case shift for the Proposition. What did Proposition 1 tell you? That in the majority of cases, these are consensual relationships. But then Proposition 2 comes up here and makes this goes in as hard as possible in the most extreme case about abuse. We don't think Proposition has been consistent, but we're willing to engage on both grounds. In my speech, a few things. First, the 3 questions to evaluate this round. What is better, a ban or regulations? Is this principally just, and is it a practically good decision for these women? Before moving on to our third substantive argument about the comparative. So first question, is a ban good? Basically, the blanket response we hear coming out of Propositions 2 to all of UN's material is that regulations won't solve. We have 2 responses to this. First, we say a banned industry typically goes underground, meaning malicious actors circumvent regulation and have the incentive to make it worse than it would be than on their side of the house. Human trafficking does not go away on either side of the house. Secondly, we would say legality actually makes it easier to regulate the industry because it allows for a legitimate version of that industry to exist. only malicious versions exist on their side of the house. Moreover, we would say women are more likely to use the most malicious means on their side of the house because they don't have access to legal means. I'll address this more in my third substantive argument. So first on to whether these are practically good decisions. They tell you a few things. Most recently in their third substantive argument, they say back home, families pressure women into leaving and families functionally sell off their children. 3 responses here. First, we would ask women once they arrived at the border or arrived at TSA, hey, is this legitimate consent? If not, they could then apply for asylum. We told you that in our model. Secondly, we would say it's irresponsible and privileged to assume that they're forced to do so. We would say in many cases, women actively take on this choice to benefit their family and send back remittances. And thirdly, we would say the comparative is far worse on their side of the house because if it's true you have abusive family structures, why then would you make it more difficult for women to get there? At best, they find ways to abuse them in more abusive ways. What else does opposition give you? They basically say these marriages will lead to abuse because they're legally disadvantaged and they're 100% submissive. We have 5 responses. First, this literally applies to all marriages which have some degree of risk of having a bad spouse. We say they're focusing this debate in the most extreme cases. Secondly, we say women can make the active choice, meaning they're likely to know how they're going to help themselves. They could do things like seek help shelters. They have a better path to citizenship on our side of the house, or they can just seek asylum, like we told you in opposition 1. Thirdly, we would say the comparative is worse on their side of the house because people still arrive and still people go through the spousal visa means, but at that point they're doing it illegally, at which point they are too afraid to go to the police because of the fact that they might have gone there through illegal means. Fourthly, we would say our model largely mitigates most of these scenarios because of the point in which we're requiring immigration enforcement to take background checks of these husbands. It is likely that the vast majority of malicious husbands will be flagged before the wife ever gets there. And fifth and finally, even in the worst case scenario, where the woman literally doesn't have access to the language, literally is isolated and locked at the house and has no access to friends or other people, their worst case scenario, we would still likely that that woman can Google in her own language on her phone and get access to a domestic violence helpline, in which case there are things like translation services, like literally the domestic violence helpline has different languages at the top, in which case even in their worst case scenario, we think it is more than likely these people will find access to help. Because their scenario is so unlikely, we don't think you should prefer it. Rather, comparable materials that in the majority of cases, people can materially better their lives because it guarantees them stability, it gives them access to the economic privileges they want. Second question, is it principally justified? Note that Proposition 1 literally says the majority of these cases are consensual, so we have a few responses. First, don't let the counterintuitiveness of this argument pass you by. Their argument is uphold people's autonomy. How do they do that? Restrict people's autonomy to make the choice to do something. And moreover, they literally say give up autonomy is giving up your humanity. We would say this justifies banning the poor from marrying the rich, but it's problematic because it feeds all of UN's principled analysis, because even if you think something is unsavory, doesn't justify the government banning it. For example, we think many people might prefer their religion over their sexuality, or vice versa, meaning we think that is a very legitimate and intimate decision that people are allowed to make. Thirdly, look at the other things that we don't ban, things like marrying or pretending to be in love for someone for immigration. Their answer is practical, but at best it undercuts their own principle. And fourth and finally, it's contingent on actually proving that it's harmful in the majority of cases. So even if you buy this principle about illegitimate contracts, they have to prove this is true in the vast majority of cases. And all of our practical analysis goes to show that even in their best case, it's contingent on the practical, and that practical is not likely. Now, I will move on to our third substantive argument, which I think actually clashes very well with a lot of the material that proposition gives you. What is the comparative? In a world where, I'll take you in a second, where we ban the importation of brides, we think there are broadly 4 other scenarios they might take. Before I get into that, go.
Transacting a person in exchange for a product or service is literally human trafficking. Why is human trafficking wrong?
Unlike human trafficking, where neither party consents, unlike slavery, where neither party consents, one of the two parties is literally consenting to that transaction. Moreover, unlike human trafficking or slavery, where you would receive nothing in benefit of that transaction, the motion literally guarantees us that the woman is getting paid the immigration fees. Moreover, we think her economically is more advantaged once she gets there. 4 scenarios. First is they become more dependent on their husband. In the event that they are not paid for, we think men will still sponsor spousal visas and women will still try to go through this process. Now, the women who want to immigrate are forced to pay their own way there. As a consequence, when they arrive, they are more saddled with debt as the process they otherwise would be. As a result, they become more economically dependent on the husband. Meaning, even if you buy all of Proposition's analysis as to how being economically dependent on your husband is bad, we think it's far worse on their side of the house at the point to which, untold you in framing, people still want to immigrate and it's hard to do so not through these means. The second scenario is a debt strangle. We think even if that's not the case, people will find a way to immigrate through other, more traditional means. Meaning they'd have to, but this is less likely, but in that case, they'd have to spend even more capital on exorbitant legal fees. So when they arrive, they're saddled with debt. And that's true even if they're relatively well off. But it's particularly problematic when they arrive with bad credit. Employers don't want to give them a job, and there's general anti-immigrant sentiment. But the third scenario is they arrive through illegal means. These are the people who still want to immigrate, but these are the people already in a scenario of no alternatives, already in a scenario of domestic partner violence, in which case they try so hard, they are more likely to subject themselves to things like human trafficking or crossing the border illegally. But fourthly, they stay in their home country, meaning they're either denied true love because they're too poor to afford the fees, and they stay at home the rest of their life knowing they missed out on the love of their life, or they would have made the decision to leave because they made the personal choice that their living conditions were no longer sustainable, but now they're stuck in those conditions. We've successfully mitigated the number of ways that these marriages will be abusive, meaning you should weigh all our other more likely scenarios. Proud to oppose.
All right, judges. Just to be very clear, what does Team Proposition have to do to win this debate based upon the conditions that were placed both by our own speakers and by Team Opposition? Let's be super explicit. We have to prove that A, there's no legitimate consent here and the concept of choice falls clearly towards our side, that B, the improvement in living conditions is worse in the vast majority of situations, even if this isn't true, we can still win, but we will prove this because, surprise, surprise, most of the world is in the United States. And third of all, we also have to choose how it is that the transactions actually here are actually, regard to the ambiguity of the law. If we can show these things, Team Proposition will clearly take this debate. We're going to do this by asking 3 points of class, right? We're going to talk about the concept of choice, we're going to talk about the shift in the environment, and we're going to talk about the ambiguity of the law. Let's begin by talking about the concept of choice. We gave you a very structured first argument where we talked about the principal difference between the idea of consent and the idea of autonomy. How you sacrifice autonomy and therefore sacrifice individual liberty at the point at which you sell yourself and become a transaction for a man, right? To this, both speakers of Team Opposition have simply repeated the line, women can make choices, women are smart, women know what's up. Look, we agree, right? Women are smart. But we think this is very separate from being in a situation where you're so desperate that you literally have to sell yourself off to another country, to sell yourself off to a man, right? We think this is a very clear distinction and a point where the line of consent no longer exists. Because at that point, what indeed is happening? What is happening is a woman has been deeply coerced by the situation of her country and by the concept of money that a man has, that she is forced to essentially sell herself here. We don't think this is consent and we don't think this is choice. Even if it was choice, however, we still win. Why is this? Because we told you in an unrefuted portion of our first argument that giving up your liberty, giving up your life, giving up your autonomy, is essentially giving up what makes you human. When we ask, would you allow for people to sell their organs? When they say we don't support slavery, we don't support human trafficking, we don't see a clear difference if someone were, for example, to sell themselves into slavery. Ghost.
You also sacrifice autonomy whenever you get on a boat from the Mediterranean to from the North Africa to the Mediterranean Sea and you don't know whether or not it's going to survive. Why should people not be able to make this choice?
We think there's a clear difference here at the point at which the person who is getting on the boat, who is sacrificing themselves and going to these things towards their family, is not becoming part of a transaction, right? We think this transactive process turns somebody into an object of connotation and essentially makes somebody someone's property, right? Because it's very nice to say that women have choice and women are very intelligent, and yes, we totally agree, right? But the thing is, the point at which you are sold is the point at which your safety is contingent on how you behave in these types of relationships, right? Because the concept of choice, this idea that they get here and it's fully transactional, and women are going to be treated great, simply isn't true, right? The reality is that the men who do this understand that what they're doing is buying women off of the internet. And because they understand this, when women arrive, what they expect of them is to essentially be treated and be extremely submissive, right? They say, you're super condescending to women. Women will be submissive. They're very strong. Okay, great, but the difference here is that the entirety of this transaction is contingent of that fact. If that is broken, what ends up happening is that women fall into abusive relationships, they're treated horribly, and they are kicked out to a point where their conditions are obliterated. That is why the concept of choice and the concept of autonomy is taken away. Because if they apply autonomy, if they apply themselves, what ends up happening is that their environment falls into ruins. If they are not submissive, if they do not fulfill the conditions that these men set out for them, they are treated horribly. Which leads us to our second argument, that is a shift in the environment. And here's where I've got to touch upon the regulations and the ideas. You can magically figure out what type of man is abusive on their side of the house, right? We, first of all, think this is extremely irrealistic because, for a couple of reasons. We think, first of all, who are the type of men who actually undergo these transactions? These are generally men who have difficulty in romance or have some type of foreign fetish, right? We think at that point, you have men who are not likely to have a lot of romantic experience and who are therefore very difficult to regulate to see if they're abusive, right? We think these types of conditions that they set out on their site are completely unrealistic, right? Beyond that, we think a lot of abusers are extremely charismatic, are extremely good at lying, are extremely good at convincing people that they're doing nothing wrong, that have all the best intentions in the world. This is literally the baseline of an abusive relationship. It's super common. And we think at the point at which you can say, oh, we can just regulate this away, all the men are going to be wonderful people, is the point at which you don't understand how it is that these processes actually look like. Because what actually ends up happening? All of their second arguments about benefits of stability and healthcare fall flat because abuse is so common, specifically because of the lack of choice and autonomy that exists on our side, which is impossible to regulate, right? But let's look at the best case scenario, right? People might fall into marriages, and people who, maybe the marriage is a little bit okay, and maybe, there's some healthcare here and there. We still think that the impact on the environment are far worse on our side of the house. Why is this? First of which, they say that the minority of situations are those where women can't speak the language and are completely isolated. Ladies and gentlemen, how many countries speak English? How many countries in these transactions speak the same languages? The majority of situations are those where extremely vulnerable women are pushed into situations where they're deeply isolated, deeply confused, and have nowhere to go. We think at this point abuse is super common because the power dynamic here is one that is fundamentally different from a poor person marrying a rich person. It is one where the conditions of the trade-off, the conditions of the person getting here are those where I have more power than you, I understand this country, I funded your visa, and therefore I control your environment because you don't understand where you are, you don't understand your community. This has impacts on mental health that weren't addressed that we think in and of themselves are awful. But beyond mental health, what you also end up doing is keeping women in a cycle where they're perpetually alone and cannot find resources. The fact that you expect women to be able to Google things takes away the fact that A, a lot of men are going to take away these tools from these women because they see them as objects that they bought off, or B, they're going to run away and divorce themselves, right? We think at the point where the best case scenario for side opposition is one where women literally escape. It's a point where we much rather have a government that is actually incentivized to improve immigration, right? Because let's look at this point of, oh, well, that doesn't matter, right? Because what actually happens at our side of the house, we understand that a government that legalizes this thing is a government that has no incentive to improve immigration laws because now they have a really profitable business to keep women entering in these areas and way easier for way to actually not have these women undergo all of these processes. Then let's go on to our third argument, that of the ambiguity of the law. This is where the US's case becomes super US-centric because there's a couple of problems here. We told you in our third argument that in the majority of situations, what ends up happening in developing countries is that people who go from a developing country to a developed country use this as a way to masquerade human trafficking. We therefore said that it is the responsibility of a developed country to say that these things should be banned because if they don't do this, they are increasing the harms of these developing countries to a point where this thing becomes extremely dangerous. To this they said that oh, you know, we don't have to defend this, and also the black market becomes really bad on our side. We have a variety of responses to this. First, we think in the best case scenario, this is a wash. The black market exists on both sides of the house as human trafficking. But we think the far more likely scenario is that if you don't ban this, what you're doing is you're legitimizing this. You're legitimizing this as a developed country. You're saying these developing countries with a lack of infrastructure, lack of government control, can maintain these practices, and you as a developed country that can actually impose checks by banning this altogether and not having weak, flimsy regulations that clearly don't work, is one that is principally more just and principally helps more women actually escape these things. On our side, rather, you make the law far more clear. You say this is not allowed because this is clearly abusing exploitative immigration laws that we are going to try to resolve and improve, right? Because the inconsistency in Team Opposition's case is that a government that both supports immigration laws and would not ban this is an inconsistent government. Because you have a far more consistent view of what a government should be doing in order to commit immigration, because we most help women, and because we understand the reality of the situation regarding autonomy and choice, we have definitively taken this debate. Thank you.
I'd like to speak for his remarks, and I'll call upon the third opposition speaker to continue opposition.
When a developed country bans a practice, it doesn't magically get all of the responsibility to change everything else around in the world. When a developed country bans a practice, it just insulates itself from all of the other comparative institutions that occur outside of that developed country. That's why the first theme of this speech is going to be on the comparative, where there are two arguments that will definitively win side opposition the debate, even if proposition wins all of their other material. Let's talk about those two arguments. First, industries that get banned usually go underground, and legality is better because it allows for regulations. This is where proposition's characterizations actually help side opposition. Let's talk about the situations proposition thinks every single woman in this industry is in. They're in a desperate situation in a developing country where the government is not really real and there are no real regulations. They're in a desperate situation where their family is pressuring them to go to another country and send them remittances. What does that family do when developed countries ban legitimate mail-order brides? That family is more likely to push them into situations like human trafficking. But what happens on our side of the house? When there are legitimate, more regulated instances of this practice occurring, those women can go to those instances instead of going to more pernicious instances. This is what Luke told you in our second speech, and this actually engages with the incentive structures of governments. Because in developing countries, if the governments aren't really here, human trafficking is a system that exists on both sides of the house, but only side opposition has a path besides that system, which is the point of a legal market in which they occur. Only when we legalize it, only when we legitimize it, as the proposition third speaker tells us, is where we can attempt to make it safe. When in a developed country, think about the incentives a developed country has when this is a legal, legitimate practice. Then they want to regulate it because they have an incentive to protect their own citizens, so they're more likely to do it better. They're more likely to have actual market protections on it. But when a developed country bans the practice, typically when the United States bans things, it's our way of shutting ourselves out from insulating ourselves from other parts of the world. When this is a market that has to occur in developed countries, then they have an actual incentive to protect people, which makes all of proposition's harms inevitable on their side of the house. This is actually most likely to occur in the developing countries that they're telling us that we ignore. They tell us that it's a wash, that we're legitimizing the industry. I've just explained why it's worse on their side of the house, because legitimization is the only metric by which people can have a path out of human trafficking, because human trafficking becomes the only option on their side of the house. The second argument we've given you under this theme is our entire third substantive argument, which got very little engagement from the third proposition speech. There are two characterizations under here. First characterization is where we take proposition at their highest ground. These are incredibly desperate scenarios. These are incredibly desperate women. They're being coerced into this choice. Just because the U.S. makes it illegal doesn't mean those people aren't going to attempt to illegally cross the border into the United States. Just because developed countries make it illegal doesn't mean that it won't occur on their side of the house as well, because people will still have this great incentive to do so. That is their characterization that they've given you, where these are the most desperate situations. But a second characterization that we think is significantly more reasonable is something that proposition is ignored throughout large portions of the space. So thank you. Is the characterization that a lot of these people are not in horrible situations in their own countries, but rather are just choosing to engage in this practice because they want to gain economic mobility. They want to move to the United States, marry someone, and then maybe someday that someone might be the president. The whole point of this argument is that there's a large swath of people that they have not characterized that are making this legitimate economic decision. The second theme in my speech is going to deal with the principle, which I think that they have really not engaged with in this debate. Before I do that, your point.
If you say this is more likely to happen in developing countries, why doesn't this mitigate all of your concerns about, things like healthcare, industry, etc.?
Absolutely not. What we're saying is that if human trafficking is a process that exists on both sides of the house, only side opposition has a differing process from human trafficking, a legitimized market that developed countries have an actual incentive to regulate, whereas developed countries have no incentive to regulate your side of the house. On the principled analysis, the framing issue here is that you should not buy side proposition's Puritan 18th century view of marriage, where it's literally like some woman shackling themselves to a man. Women are not being sold. They are tricking rich people into paying their immigration fees. That is the characterization that we've given you on side opposition. The passive voice that their Proposition 3 continues to use when describing the situation is exactly what side opposition is critiquing. Because we're saying that the women on these mail order bride sites make that active choice in a lot of instances. Proposition 3's argument about selling yourself to a man or selling yourself, their mechanisms apply to regular situations of immigration as well, as incorrectly points out in a POI. When they say that people are trying to make this desperate decision, that they're in these desperate situations, that would apply to literally almost any single decision someone can make. In fact, so many of their mechanisms just apply to like regular marriages, which is something that we push throughout the side of the debate. It is likely that opposition has correctly won the principle. But what is the implication of this principle? This means that if they prove in the most extreme hypotheticals, where they keep adding conditions upon conditions upon conditions to resolve every single scenario that we bring up, then they're only proving in a minority of cases this is not legitimate consent. But from Op 1, we told you the burden on them is to prove an intrinsic harm to this industry which justifies a government ban. Given that they've not done that, they're not going to win the principle analysis and they're not going to justify a ban, which incidentally is the first burden the Proposition 3 speaker placed on themselves, which means that they've lost this debate. The third thing that I want to touch on is the direct benefits of engaging in this practice. The Proposition 3 just dismissed these benefits as like a little healthcare, as if we were like sprinkling salt on a dish. It's not like a little healthcare. It's a lot of things that people choose to directly engage in to better their lives, to send remittances back to their families, to economically engage in mobility, and to have some shot that they think that they have. But Proposition's main argument here is touching on domestic abuse and the abusiveness of the relationship, which is why I'm going to spend the last 2 whole minutes of my speech talking about this argument. The first thing I want to touch on here is that the 3's characterization of this argument applies to all marriages. Think about the power structure the 3 is talking about. Just having a different language or not having friends. The state does not ban all marriages because some marriages have some conditions on them that would result in a power dynamic, because then we would literally not have marriages whatsoever. Rather, the solution is to target intimate partner violence as itself, but not in ban a practice that may apply to other things. When the 2 tells you a characterization, like having a child creates a power dynamic, or like you may not want to leave your family, note that this is a decision, unfortunately, that so many women have to make regardless of what type of marriage that they're in, because they may want to make the decision between preserving their family or tearing their family apart. That's why these discussions matter so much, because the decisions women have to make are so complicated in every side of the house. But the difference between our sides of the house is that we recognize that these are women's decisions, not the government's. The second thing I want to touch on here is that we support a lot of measures to mitigate this. We've told you from our Opposition 1 that we support background checks. No, this will not solve like weird fetishy men that like they're talking about on their side of the house. Obviously not. No government policy would ever solve that nonsense, but the whole point is we're able to mitigate all of these things. The thing that we also support on our side of the house is things like asylum measures. There's so many measures that you can use. You can attempt to find a friend. You can attempt to call a domestic violence hotline. All of these things exist. But the comparative is always worse given the first argument I've made in this speech. But the last thing I want to say is if you find yourself finding the proposition's mechanisms applying to all marriages, consider whether you would consider banning all of those marriages to resolve this problem. If that's the case, you would side with opposition.
I thank the speaker for his remarks, and I invite the opposition reply speaker to close the case for the opposition speaker.
I want to remind you as to how narrow the debate Proposition 3 made it, so the Proposition reply can't try to salvage it. Proposition 3 said this: these are women with zero English, these are women who are submissive and can't stand up for themselves. They are locked up in a room so they know no other human being than their fetish husband, and they are left with no access to internet or technology. Like, I don't know how this isn't the most extreme form of the debate, at which point we think we've been far more reasonable. 2 questions to evaluate the round then. Will these women's material lives increase, the burden Proposition initially put on us before they shifted? And then, is it okay for the government to condone this? First, will these women's material lives increase? At their best ground, they said it will lead to abuse. But we think we successfully mitigated both the likelihood and impact of this. We said in the vast majority of cases, husbands aren't abusive. Even if they are, we think many would get flagged by our regulations. But even if they are abusive, we told that women will likely know how to help themselves. We told you they know how to seek help shelters, seek asylum from the government, use their new path to citizenship to escape their husband, or literally, get this, use Google. We made it clear why you shouldn't care about the most extreme cases, because that would justify banning all marriages, because all marriages have the risks that proposition tells you about. But the reason we don't ban marriage is because we realize that the vast majority are beneficial, the vast majority are a legitimate decision. But take them on their highest ground and say abuse is real and likely. We told you all of that is worse on their side of the house, where the incentive to immigrate still exists. We said now these women still get a spousal visa, but it's not paid for, so they're more economically reliant on their husband. These abusive families still coerce these women, but now they don't have a legal method to get there. Or they still have the self-propelled incentive to immigrate, so they go through illegal means because they have no process to do it legally. What then is the heart of this debate? What is opposition's case? That women in their home countries make a personal and intimate choice that their current life is unsustainable. So they choose to make the decision to allow someone else in another country to pay for their legal fees. And once they get there, they are in a safer environment, a more sustainable environment. They have access to healthcare, and they just generally are more content with their life. It doesn't matter if Proposition doesn't think this is a good life. If the women make the choice for themselves, that it is. These women now live a materially better life, both in their minds and in reality, than they did before. Then the question simply becomes, well, is it okay for the government to condone this? We believe at the point in which we've successfully proven that it's practically beneficial, that it is okay for the government to condone it. What was Proposition's best material? They gave you this convoluted principle, first about autonomy and then giving up liberty. No, this is not slavery. Slaves didn't have the choice to make to give up their liberty. We don't like it when people remove liberty liberty, we think that's bad, but voluntarily giving up liberty, we think is justified for the government to condone, particularly when that choice to give up the liberty is in the pursuit of maximizing more liberty later. That is what untold you down the bench, I carried down the bench, and Ishan put the nail in the coffin. Why then should you prefer our material? 3 reasons. First, even if these people are coerced, that isn't to say it can't be a rational yet coerced decision. Secondly, a lack of autonomy still exists on their side of the house. They're just coerced into worse means. It's what's untold you about how these people still have the incentive to get from North Africa to Europe. Now they just do it by on a sketchy dinghy across the Mediterranean and are more likely to drown with their friends and family. And thirdly, we said choice is the primary consideration because they only partially solve, but they 100% violate our principle. Very proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for his remarks, and I invite the co-position by speaker to close the presentation.
Your bench, we told you that it is contradictory to say that these people are coming from the worst case scenario. So they are coming from positions of instability and simultaneously say that when they get to these countries, they'll just get good lives because they can just make any choice that is consensual, although they didn't have a choice in the first place, right? There's 2 points of clash in this debate. First of all, that of the principle of individuality. Second of all, that of what happens in these places. But before anything, let us just engage with the idea of the worst and best case scenarios, right? Because I think it is completely unfair for Team USA to say, no, those are the worst case scenarios, and simultaneously in all the case, build the idea that these people come from the worst and most vulnerable countries, right? In the cases in which even you come, like being a rich person or like being a medium income person, we told you that our principle still stands to the point that we tell you the principle is that it is wrong to have a trade-off with marrying with someone, right? The fact that they just answer that the choice is problem is an issue, right? First point of clash, that of the principle of individuality. Since our first argument, we told you 2 main lines, of the consent and autonomy. On consent, the answer that they give is these people have no other option, to which we say exactly that's what there's no consent. But autonomy is the main part of this argument, where we say you are selling yourself, you are selling your liberty to a long extent. That is to say, they do have to engage with what happens if like a man just doesn't allow for you to do certain things, right? If they start being abusive, to the extent that they only answer, but they'll give you a home, right? To the extent that we said in our second speech, they can just not do that, and we still fulfill the fact that in many cases they can just disengage at the point at which they want, and these people are left alone. There is an issue, right? Autonomy does rely on the fact that having a trade-off in the first place was an issue, right? We talk about the fact that the government is legitimizing this trade-off, to which they answer, but when you ban it, you cannot regulate it, right? There's obviously going to be marginal problems on both sides of the house, but we do think that the majority of people will not do this because just simply they are afraid of the law, right? We think that is completely weak reputation. When they talk about things such as this is tricking rich people into getting into our relationship in their third speech, we see our principle still stands, right? In the moment in which we're just using these rich people as a means to an end, we do think that the point of autonomy and of this trade-off does still stand, right? We told you about the reason why the principle stands is because we are capable of proving to you that the places that we are talking about is individuals that in the best cases are doing something that is wrong because there's a conditional to it, right? No matter where you come from, no matter what the purpose is, this principle is still contingent. When our second speech we say, maybe that's not the majority of cases, right? Let's also talk about people that are coming from backgrounds. They just say that's a contradiction, with which we move to our second point of clash. Because they talk about the fact that the motion just assumes that they paid a tribute. But when we ask what happens when they just disengage with these women, we receive no answer. They talk about the fact that in the worst cases, they can just go to the asylum or to close services. We said, A, that is US-centric, and if that was true, we think people would just do it in the first place, right? If your systems were as effective, people should not go through these systems, they would just apply to asylum in the first place. They are not telling you why this is a problem in the first place. For them to tell you that other things are wrong doesn't mean that we should not ban this one specifically, right? Because when we are capable of telling you that if these countries were so good, then you would not have these types of changes in the first place, and these women should not have to make this trade-off, unlike tricking men, this will not happen, right? We told have a disincentive to better the system. We hear no response in four speeches, right? And even if you don't buy that, the fact that we receive no answer does win us a debate. Because as far as in the second and third speech we told you, less people are likely to just subsidize a migrant to go if they can just make them marry them is a very important thing, right? There is a disincentive for governments to have better policy, to have better engagement with these individuals. As far as we are capable of telling you that this regulation is going against men that cannot be regulated because they come as for things such as fetishes and like other interests, and they say this cannot be regulated, but we were capable of proving to you that that is the majority of cases. They don't have a case in which to stand for those reasons we are proposed.
Okay, teams. First of all, I want to congratulate you. When I saw this motion, I thought, what is going to happen? Instead, we were treated to a very, very interesting and engaging debate on a topic that I think we sometimes don't really think about. We were really impressed with how much content and material you guys could all come up with, on in the impromptu session, like the prep session. So congratulations, both teams. As is the case in World School Style, I'm going to give you the decision first and then give you the explanation for the decision. The panel is not unanimous. It is a 2-1 decision, and it is a 2-1 decision in favor of side opposition. So let's go through where we saw this debate going. We do feel that both teams were particularly engaging in their animation, the way in which they used their styles to be able to further the arguments and further the power of their content. What was particularly impressive was the way that we were getting both impassioned pleas for us to understand the importance of this topic, but also we had some humor thrown in there, which is always really nice when we are talking about quite a serious topic, but it was appropriate humor, so that was terrific. On this particular issue, we did feel, or at least the judges felt, that the United States was slightly better in terms of their voice modulation, their emphasis, their ability to both be passionate and also be moderate in terms of their weighing, in terms of their assessment. So, but we felt that both teams were very, very strong in this. In terms of the content, we heard a debate that really focused on both, the principles behind this practice of mail order brides. And proposition does, establish or outlines a principle of argument that talks about whether or not this practice could ever be consensual, whether or not women who were coming from developing countries under which conditions were perhaps so dire that they would ever be able to really make a free choice, and that the choices that they made in engaging in this practice were inherently coercive. We felt that there was a continuation of this argumentation all the way down the bench, and that all 3 speakers were essentially trying to remind us of this. What we felt was that opposition responded with another principled argument, this idea of whether or not women in their agency and their autonomy, given the choices that they were faced with in their home countries, was actually in a position to give their consent, and they argued that they were, that this was not always just about very poor women in coercive situations. This was also about autonomous or rational actors weighing up the options that are facing them and making a free choice in that respect. One of the judges actually felt that this issue of consent and autonomy was actually quite powerfully contested on the proposition side. But two of the panelists did not feel that they were able to necessarily respond to the characterization of the women who were making these choices, because there were actually different kinds of women that we were talking about, and the challenge was proposition's argument seemed to be characterizing all women in the same way. So that created a bit of a difference in opinion in terms of how the judges weighed this particular issue. What becomes really contentious is the practical outcomes of this choice. So proposition actually talks about all of the the challenges about making this choice and then discovering that this choice puts you into a worse opposition. So it's not only that they were coerced in this, but also too that they then faced a life whereby more of their choices were limited or restricted, and what would happen. Two of the panelists actually felt that what was lacking in this debate, and this is for both teams, is the ability to locate these people in the places in which this would be most true. So there was a tacit kind of acceptance as the debate unfolded that we were actually talking about women coming to like the United States, right? Because the choice, the outcome or the benefits of that choice was painted by the opposition as one that is always going to be preferable to the conditions that they left behind, and that there were always going to be ways in which any kind of terrible situations that they found themselves in could actually be mitigated by the structures that were in place. Proposition actually does at the very beginning of their debate say that this is actually in other sorts of places, such as for example China, but they don't proceed to locate that argument throughout the debate. So that's actually where strategically it becomes a problem. Because if we are to accept proposition's characterization of the harmful outcomes of this choice, you need to locate it in a place where the consequences of that choice matches like the degree of harm that you are claiming this practice brings. So we felt that opposition strategy in terms of continuing to locate the issue in a country whereby the consequences of that choice could always be mitigated either by the legal structures or by the support services that may exist in that country, or by the goodwill of citizens willing to help them. Like they were successful in being able to demonstrate that there was always going to be a better outcome for these women. And so it also justifies the rationality of the choice that these women make, even if the conditions under which they may have made them, according to proposition's claim, was coercive or perhaps desperate, right? So that's actually where we felt strategy comes into play, because the content then is impacted more in the world in which opposition wants to locate it, not necessarily the world in which opposition locates this concern. And so that's the reason why two of the judges gave it to the opposition and one gave it to the proposition. Thank you very much.